Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first lecture of our lunchtime lecture series as part of the summer programs in 2022. I'm very excited for all our in-person students and remote students to get the opportunity to participate in these lunchtime lectures. And I'm very excited to welcome our first two guests, two dear colleagues of mine from UCLA AUD. I'm very happy to welcome Katy Barkan and Neil Denari, who are both faculty here in AUD. And we have Kaden, our program manager, who is going to introduce them. But I want to personally thank Katy and Neil for making time during their summer to join us and to spend to share some of their time with us to kind of give you guys an insight into their work, and both professionally as well as in the academia. And I think it should be a very exciting lunchtime lecture. So thank you so much for coming.
Hello. So I would like to introduce our first guest for today, Neil Denari. He's a principal at NMDA, Neil M. Denari Architects Inc, and a professor at UCLA Architecture and Urban Design. Among his many awards is the Los Angeles AIA Gold Medal, received in 2011. His work has been included in many exhibitions, including solo shows, the Artless Drawing in 2010 at Ace Gallery LA, and Aperiodic City at Peace Space in 2017 in Rhinebeck, New York. His work is permanently held by 8 major museums around the world. With NMDA, Denari works on building projects in North America, Europe, and Asia. In 2012, NMDA won first prize in the new Keelung Harbor Service Building competition. Denari lectures worldwide and has been a visiting critic at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, Rice, and UC Berkeley, among other schools, and was the director of SCI-Arc from 1997 to 2002. He is the author of Interrupted Projections, Gyroscopic Horizons, Chromatopia, Power Complex, and Mass X. So please welcome me.
Well, needless to say, housing is a global phenomenon, a global condition today, obviously a global concern. And I'm just going to talk about housing in a fairly narrow sense because it's a project that's, it's super complex. Why Paris? I could pick a number of cities to start with, including Los Angeles. We might know Los Angeles a little bit more maybe than Paris. Housing is a product of time and place. It also is a product of various forces like politics, money, and materials, population growth, etc. Let's just take this as an example to kind of launch into what will be a series of projects, both built and unbuilt, by my office over 15 years or so. We've worked on a lot of housing projects. I made some selections today. So my image up there is cropping a yellow dot. Behind there, there's a yellow dot in a suburb called Bobigny, and the yellow dot in the Latin Quarter. So there's the Latin Quarter. It's the old city, not super planned on the one hand, scaled not to the car, scaled to intimacy of essentially everything that a city is made of, which is the agreement of people living in proximity to trade. So cities are about commerce, trade, and cities, of course, are about supporting at all levels infrastructurally the people to be able to trade. You can live in a hut in the forest, you're not trading, you're doing something else. In cities, you gather together to make a mercantile project. After World War II, all across the globe, questions of the faith in the old city versus the questions of the new city, and in the periphery of Paris, just like in Stockholm, or in New Jersey, or in the Valley, what do we build, especially in landscapes which were maybe unbuilt and fallow nature, et cetera. So you find projects like this, which couldn't be further from the city in Paris. It's as if you took the void of the street in the old city and turned it into a solid and then made it wavy to fit into a landscape. There's a suburb called Nanterre, famous for uprisings in the 1960s, et cetera. You can see it's even past La Défense. And there's well, at least in terms of this kind of typology of post-war housing, a famous project called Tour Ayo. It's named after the architect. Not many projects are named after architects today. Generally, it's like, do your project, get out of the way. You can see that this is a project that's towers in the park, which was a philosophy of thinking about design, both pre-war and post-war. You can live in the sky if you can live on a smaller footprint, if you can put more people essentially in greater and smaller levels of proximity to one another in a tower, then you'd liberate the landscape and allow green and light and air. That was a major premise for essentially the world after World War II, and essentially a critique by erstwhile critique of the old city, because what cropped up, during the 20th century was mobility, the car, and then other things that we have today, like television and media, which produce forms of dislocation. Questions about alienation, living in towers, disconnected from the landscape, et cetera, were also going on at the same time. I particularly like this project for its strange audacity, trying to bring softness to the extruded object of the tower, and even further color in the weirdest windows you can imagine. Very cool project. When you get up close to it, this pixelated landscape projected onto these soft extruded forms, no rectangular windows. Boy, if I could afford it, I would never do a rectangular window in a housing project. Made a lot of renderings of projects without rectangular windows. The relationship between that window and the view, curtains on the inside, a kind of domestication, and the people who live in housing, of course, even just scratches the surface of what the questions are. So questions about cities, economies, agreement to trade, forms of cities based on time periods, and also based on the philosophies of architects, theoretically, of what's new and what should be built. So this is just a small slice of that particular moment in the 20th century. So what I'm going to show you are 4 or 5 or 6 projects from my office that are all in different sites in different cities that essentially take up what Kisho Kurokawa, Japanese architect, the architect of the Capsule Hotel, which sadly was begun demolition. He said housing and the city are just space units of space. And when you get down to it, your apartment, where if you grew up in a high rise, a room in your house, et cetera, they start to become discrete space units, and then how they relate to other space units. But he was doing that to kind of abstract things, and also space units, in the case of the capsules, they fit into infrastructure and they fit into grids. Going back to cities, this is Los Angeles. That's the Beverly Center, one of the largest buildings in Los Angeles. And this is a 6-story housing project, 60 units, about 1,000 square feet each, 1-bedroom apartments. They're units in the city, and this is about trying to fill in the city. This is a fallow site. There's hardly anything on it, yet it's in a rather dense neighborhood. So essentially, this is an accumulation of this idea of space units where we meet zoning envelopes, in this case, a year or more of conversation in the community and the city about density. Density, generally, if you're a liberal thinker, would be good. Question of suggesting, if not demanding, that people even circulate in Los Angeles outside of the autonomous vehicle for sharing, for walking, etc. This is a bit of a taller building on La Cienega, and if you're looking at it going, wow, it's shocking in its height next to the context, give it time. The city will change. This is not a question of being inhuman or indifferent to the context. This is actually just dealing with the projection of the city growing taller and navigating and negotiating what will come with that, which is movement and circulation. It's a pretty straightforward building. You've seen projects like this around town. They're sitting on a concrete podium. You build a wood frame up above that, and then it's a question of the kind of fit and finish of the building, how well your balconies work, views, light, etc. And we're playing some small games here to shift the facade around to essentially produce what I call the XYZ zebra effect, the diagonal effect, the optical effect around the nature of housing, which tends to always want to stack and snap together. Even in the case of the tower that we just saw that was extruded and soft, it's otherwise mechanically repetitive in the vertical axis. And some details of the project. This will start construction in about half a year over on La Cienega. A project that's relatively new, it's about 6 months old. This is a small infill project. By the way, that was what we would call an infill housing project, constrained by zoning quite heavily. Most of these projects, if not all of them, are deeply constrained by zoning. This is a small corner infill site on West Adams. It's a transitional neighborhood. That's potentially a euphemism for gentrification, quite openly and honestly. I did 3 projects on this street, a hotel, housing, and an office building. It's both a modest building and also a strange project. There's the footprint, a kind of leftover corner. There's zoning forces, like the chamfer on the corner is forced by zoning. The rest of the project is what we call a maximum FAR project. The previous one you saw was a maximum FAR project. FAR stands for floor area ratio. If you take the site of take the area of the site, say it's 10,000 feet. If you have a floor area ratio of 3, you can build 30,000 square feet. And zoning limits the amount of FAR you can build. It's not a free world in that sense. By the way, the 2 most important and biggest housing projects I'm working on at the moment, I can't show you. They're both in Vancouver, and they have they're tower projects. They're much different sort of zoning. So you can see there's 4 units packed around a long core. Notice the 2 stairs in the middle of the plan seems redundant. Actually, they're redundant, but they're code-wise necessary for fire life safety, for being able to escape. But otherwise, the units are simply finding their shape based on the zoning and the footprint. We have open space requirements. All buildings have open space requirements, meaning shared amenity space. Here in a courtyard that we call, well, this building is called half court housing, as if it was a courtyard housing sliced in half, the other half not present, with rooftop amenities on top. It's otherwise a project that's very simple and very plain spoken. It's a wood frame stucco building, and here the miracle was me being able to ask the client if I could paint permanent shadows on the building. So these are odd permanent shadows as a form of graphic design to produce a, let's say, my own personal secret code of graphic representation. So when you see the diagonal, that's as if the orange part was projected out, producing a trompe l'oeil effect of shadow making. Not a new idea, but certainly vis-a-vis paint, a pretty economic way to make form. And we have shadows. There's the real shadow coming from the sun. And then we've got projected shadows that are mythical. They actually project up, which of course would never happen. A proposal for housing in Sacramento. Anyone from Northern California? Sacramento, yeah, this is near the American River on the north side of Sacramento. And the FAR for this site was 1.5. Normal FAR for a lot of projects, it's a big footprint. That's a one-story warehouse. And so the proposal was for housing in essentially an industrial district where the city is asking for essentially a kind of transformation of districts. We need more footprint that's allowable to build housing in cities. If we don't transform them here in Los Angeles, the single family house is a little bit under siege. We may not be building as many as we have in the past because we need to produce a higher density on that particular footprint. So with a 1.5 FAR, you get a relatively familiar project with parking requirements as they are. So oddly enough, this produces a perimeter block kind of housing, which we would understand from the oldest aspect of Paris, building on the street. Now, these aren't really pedestrian streets. They're double loaded buildings in a drive-in, drive-out world. So it's not a pedestrian world. And one does the best one can to distribute the mode of transportation here. But in this case, instead of setting buildings in a field with perhaps parking at the perimeter, we push it to the interior and make a series of discrete buildings with slices and gardens in between. Housing is wants to push back on novelty. Housing wants to push back on innovation, or I should say developers do. They have their logic, they have their pro forma, they have ambitions to maximize. In the best cases with the best developers, they also have the ambition to leave something behind that's great. It's not always the case. You hope to find yourself engaged with those sorts of clients. Mostly that's the case with us. A modest building as well, trying to produce some density, an image and a vision of density within a project, which on paper, in terms of numbers, isn't very dense. 1.5 FAR is the general form of density that we have in a place like Los Angeles or in a lot of places like California. This isn't next to a transit district. If you notice the larger projects, let's say on the Expo line at Bundy, at La Cienega, at Culver City, there are density bonuses there. So let's say even in post-war projects that we were looking at in Paris, where there's parking in relation to housing, here we're trying to, if you look at this scene, you can see it as a drive-in, drive-out world, attempting or hoping to become a project that is more about community rather than autonomous buildings in a green landscape. This is a bit of an older project proposed for Nashville, Tennessee. I worked on it between 2001 and 2006. This is the present state in 2022, and the yellow line was the site owned by a single family, accumulated over time. It was an old meatpacking plant, these old red brick buildings, which if you're from places like Portland or Brooklyn, are part of renovation and preservation and trying to make the city a tapestry of time periods. Housing, since we worked on it, has been built in the two corners of the site. This was our proposal in 2005. You can see mostly the idea was single ownership, allowing a plan that would have a continuity of voids. You can see that the gardens and the voids around these courtyards opening up to the Cumberland River and integrating with the existing projects was a very simple, very clear, straightforward way of trying to densify the site and then essentially modulating height from towers to low rise to mid-rise point towers, double-loaded buildings, et cetera, kind of variety of typologies that would be thought of as being buildable here, all in this kind of chromatic range of green. An invited competition in Frankfurt. This is 2015. I think 10 architects from around the world were invited to do a tower in Frankfurt in a new part of the town, Europa Vertel, near the Messe, the convention center on the west side of the city, a little bit of a newer part. You can see this main boulevard, and there's a important throughway and bridge, and to make a tower. The competition brief, like you get in a lot of competitions, please build us an icon, please make an icon. It's just a housing tower. But, you know, the developers, it was, by the way, Porsche was the developer, or let's say they were the people who were lending their name to the project. It was a kind of a gateway site from the older city to the newer city. Frankfurt is a banking town. It has some interesting high rises from the 1960s with new materials and so forth, curtain wall projects. This project, in many respects, is both a project which is about standing out and fitting in, and the base is a project which agrees to the urban condition of buildings built on the main boulevard. That's actually a courtyard building. The lower part's a courtyard building with smaller units, and then you get the tower. So it's a podium and tower mongrel, I called it, a kind of a strange hybrid between the nature of the tower as an iconic device, as a vertical device, as a high density device, just like we saw in social housing outside of Paris, in this case, you know, branded to a luxury market. We didn't win, but as I saw in the site plan this morning, nothing has been built. So nothing to feel bad about. And lastly, a project from 2012 in New York. If you've been to New York, you might have seen this building accidentally. If you've been on the High Line is the second most visited tourist site, I suppose. It was never meant to be that. It was meant to be a kind of local form of circulation. You can see it's a very tight-fitting site, and the building did produce, in this case, a curious kind of erstwhile monument. It's along the High Line, so we have a built-in audience to the project. You can see it resembles in its real nature the grid of the city, which is just a series of extruded space units. In this case, because of the very, very special condition of the site, I was able to essentially reshape it. You can see it's almost a Janus-faced schizophrenic building, a party wall that agrees to the grid of the city, and a promiscuous side, which has a certain amount of freedom. Well, freedom that we asked for and we were granted in the form of 7 waivers. We have private space that actually exists in public space, the only building in New York that does that. Thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce the second guest speaker for today, Katy Barkan. Katy Barkan's award-winning Los Angeles-based practice, Now Here, focuses on a range of speculative and built projects and works to transgress the categorical distinction between building, object, text, and drawing, to imagine alternative engagements with architecture. She was the 2020 recipient of the Rome Prize in Architecture at the American Academy in Rome. Barkan has been a lecturer at AUD since 2014. Before coming to AUD, she was a faculty at Harvard GSD from 2012 to 2014. Prior to finding her own practice, she worked and collaborated with several practices, including Architecture Research Office, MOS, and Preston Scott Cohen. Her work and writing has been published in Architectural Record, Architects Magazine, Pool, Clog, and Platform. Before turning her attention to architecture, Katy worked at Art Forum magazine in New York. Please welcome.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. I felt like I saw new echoes or something, seeing the work again. It's fantastic. So I look forward to the conversation. What I thought I would do today was I was kind of trying to think about where you guys are at in kind of day one of the whole damn thing. And I was just trying to think about what it is that kind of has animated me towards architecture, what it was that kind of captured my attention and continues to capture my attention. And it felt like it was really the nexus of these three words that have kind of continually drawn me to architecture, the pursuit of these kind of different bodies of knowledge that are embedded in kind of thinking about architecture, building itself, and teaching or pedagogy. So I thought I would just briefly show you maybe two projects within each category, and that kind of frames the way that I work, kind of toggling between these modes. So I'll show you kind of two speculative projects, installation projects that form, like underpin some of my thinking, two residential projects that I'm working on, and I'm at the kind of single family residential scale. That's where I'm working at right now. And then I'll show you two projects that we did here at AUD, an undergrad studio and a grad studio. So you have a sense of how all of this feeds back in and out between those three. So to begin with, I think first thing I would say is that in my mind, architecture is not as much, is as much about making and articulating problems as it is about solving them, right? So to first kind of situate where I'm coming from, I wanted to show you some of the positions and interests I've been exploring in my office now here, which I founded in 2017. And that I'm kind of playing out through speculative projects and installations. The first of which is an installation I did here in the gallery that you guys have probably passed through, and that's called 6 Work Surfaces. So the driving interest of the two projects that I'm going to show is really to challenge the ways that architectural form asserts its authority over our spatial experience, and how instead we might reconsider form and material to produce multiple and conflicting experiences and occupancies. So to test this out, in this installation, I propose to place unlike, simultaneous, and overlapping systems of value within a single spatial composition of the gallery. So the installation consisted of a series of odd white walls that mimic the logic of the gallery and juxtapose them with a series of misbehaved and misaligned shadow figures that swerve and spill to suggest other directions and priorities in the space. So against the kind of white gallery walls and their attendant postures of authority and neutrality, I was interested in making visible other systems of value that would challenge, undermine, and problematize that kind of formal singularity. So the plush, red, carpeted forms domesticate, ornament, and transgress the kind of institutional postures of the walls, flapping and curling over them, lining them, furnishing them, inviting alternative occupations of the space. As a result, the kind of intense horizontality of the carpets, their redness and softness against the vertical figures of the walls drew attention to the ground and its material as another kind of work surface in architecture, one that can carry with it a different set of values, not typically admitted into the space of the architectural installation, or maybe not considered enough within the field at the moment. And I'll kind of put ticks in all of this, and hopefully some of these things will emerge as you see some of the built work. So the next project I'll show really builds off of this, and it's called Obelisk Interior, and it operates, a radically different scale. So in 2020 and 21, I was a recipient of the Rome Prize in Architecture at the American Academy, and I went there to study the obelisks, which are these strange monuments, right? And to consider them as the original contested monuments, right? Enduring symbols of power that have been pillaged, relocated, and repositioned over time, kind of rewriting the city of Rome with each regime of power. And they're kind of these perennially recurring monuments. So there was a slide there of another obelisk, but let's just talk about this one. There are more obelisks in Rome than any other city in the world. There's 18, kind of ranging from kind of ancient Egypt all the way to the fascist monuments. I was interested in how they keep showing up in architecture as kind of an origin myth of the most kind of abstract and pure singular form that kind of does it all, right? And I was kind of interested in challenging that. So the obelisks really are difficult architectural objects to study because on the one hand, they're so extraordinarily reduced, so incongruously insignificant in plan. This is a plan view, there's a little person in there. It's about the scale of an obelisk. And yet they're so outsized in their elevational effect, making them hard to measure. Their presence is elusive and hard to kind of grasp and get around. So they're both small, they're like small, big things and big, small things. And that quality is one that I find peculiar and very relevant to architecture, where we're operating, we're not making the city, we aren't working on the city, we're working on objects that have kind of impacts and effects that exceed them. So what became clear to me as I studied the monuments was that in order to destabilize these intransigent forms, I had to widen my lens to admit not only the object itself, but the many conditions that surround it, that claim it, that figure it, that imagine it, etc. So here you can see the long shadow of the Vatican obelisk. I was there and it was COVID, it was totally empty. So I could get something like this. So while the form looms, the form of the obelisk looms from a distance, it kind of, the vertical axis gives way as you approach it and then starts to reinscribe itself in other more subtle and kind of hazy ways in the city, something more contingent and ephemeral. And I was kind of interested in that as a place for architecture to work. So kind of taking these observations back into the studio, I was looking at making drawings and collages and folded paper and some very simple things like this that started to give me tactics and strategies for unfolding new ideas. And these studies culminated in an installation that I proposed for the American Academy courtyard, where I inscribed a one-to-one replica of the Vatican obelisk. It just so happened that the courtyard of the Academy measured with where the trees clear, that measurement was 83 feet, which happens to be precisely the dimension of the Vatican obelisk. So it had to be. So here it is. So the obelisk is held in tension by 4 cables and kind of placed floating horizontally, suspended above a cardinal pink figure of the shadow cast by the once standing obelisk. So it's hovering and light, and it's registering the change in breeze and multiplying the play of light. As Neil pointed out, there's the kind of projected shadow, right? The kind of fake shadow. And then there's the actual shadow in all of its kind of ephemerality and changeability. So the obelisk became kind of an equal measure, delicate and intrusive, right? It clogged up the whole space, and yet it was light and floating. So coming upon the horizontal figure, on the one hand, made the enormity of the obelisk measurable, while at the same time it felt miniaturized, domesticated, intimate within the interior of the Academy. So that duality was also manifested in the material qualities, which produced a kind of massive and vivid reading from afar and something far more translucent and elusive upon approach. The materials of the project were, I was using scaffolding netting and gravel paver. So quite possibly the most pervasively used materials in all of Rome. Found in every restoration construction project and yet never kind of admitted as legitimate materials, let's say. So I was interested in bringing forward what is hidden in plain sight, what falls out of our attention, what is presumed invisible in the built environment. I think this should play, yeah. So I was, in bringing these abject materials into the Academy, I was kind of thinking about it, and actually all these materials were sourced from the gardeners and the maintenance facilities of the Academy, so nothing was bought other than the pink paint, of course. They don't happen to have that lying around. I was just interested in what other registers one could explore in a new kind of monumentality. So ultimately, thinking about something as intransigent as the obelisk allowed me to discover the invisible networks and proliferation of relationships that surround objects as a way of undermining the hegemony of the form. And really gave me new strategies and tactics, or maybe put a finer point on some of the strategies and the tactics I've been working at with architecture more generally. So it may be a bit of a leap. You might be wondering how this makes its way into housing and houses, because I was trying to think about how to position this lecture, focus on that kind of work. And so I'll try and draw the lines, between these, or maybe allow you to kind of make the connections. But here are 2 kind of recent projects. One is a built project. It's called Half House. It's here in Sherman Oaks in the Valley. If anybody here is from the San Fernando Valley, yes, no, okay, terrible. I grew up there. Yeah, and then another project that's being built right now. So the first project, Half House, is a single family house here. The project takes on the typical LA gabled bungalow to both magnify and undermine the values of the suburban house, to put on edge its ideals of self-similarity, privacy, isolation, and speculation. So I'm kind of thinking about another end of housing. You know, if Neil is kind of working in the developer end and like where it is that he can work, I'm kind of taking on the single family, the remnants, whatever is left of the single family house project in LA. So the design set about expanding an existing 1940s bungalow by splitting it in two and juxtaposing a portion of the existing structure against a new abstract figure that echoes and plays with the roof lines of the block. In effect, the house can be read as one house, two houses, and half a house interchangeably. To maintain the intimacy and scale of the original house, while accommodating the client's desire for welcoming in a broader network of activities for their kids and neighbors, a gap was introduced to cut against the notion of the house as a fixed threshold between the street in front and the private yard in back. Instead, the central void draws the front yard through with directness and immediacy. From the exterior, two domestic figures sit side by side, framing a void. And upon entry, the void is revealed as an interior light well between the old and the new, bringing light and views into the center of the house through the overlapped roof lines. On the interior, the house is reduced to a perimeter condition, with the rooms and programs pushed all the way to the periphery to draw activities outward rather than inward. And you can see here in the back how the house kind of pivots and rotates to accommodate the 10-foot setback from the garage and the existing house. So some of the ways in which codes and things start to inscribe their way into projects, maybe this is kind of one such moment. So the house has this sense of expanding to the deck and the pool beyond. So by pushing the programs of the house to the periphery, the activities within are loosened, at times spilling out and merging with the neighborhood, at times gathering the space within. On the second floor, the rotation in plan allows for a change in proportion in the typical corridor space, making for an active hangout for the kids overlooking the living areas below. And this is that hangout space. And you can see the clerestory window that's kind of pinched between the two roof lines. So in this view, we're looking back through the central passage, back out to the street between old and new, and the kind of clerestory and the cut between above. So the new form both fits in and sticks out, strategically disguising the change in scale of a two-story addition and setting it back from the street, minimizing its perceived height through a strict regulation of slopes that match the adjacent roof line profiles. So if you see the roofs of the adjacent house, that was a really critical kind of component of the project, because much of the way that a project like this plays out is by leveraging the expertise of and the knowledge of the contractors and the framers and the people on site. So it was very important to figure out how to make the moves I was making within the kind of script that was already available, right? And within the kind of expertise available. So these really, the roof was taking the 312 and the 712 adjacent roof lines and rotating and cropping that, so that from the point of view of budget and construction, this thing was like totally normative, maybe not totally, but fairly normative. And what it allowed me to do was to also, in setting it up this way, was to defamiliarize the neighbors, right? The neighbor's roof starts to become something that might be read differently than before by virtue of the fact that this is next to it. So that kind of implicating the entire block through the single intervention was something that I've been interested in. So it intervenes, the half house intervenes in its suburban fabric by not exactly fitting in or sticking out, by mobilizing the logic of its context. And it is both part of and different from its neighbors, implicating them and casting them in a new light. So the second house, which doesn't yet have a name, and there's many ors that could be here, slip house, or a loose collection of floors is where we're at right now, is about to start construction in Los Feliz. So this is the first time I'm showing it. It's kind of a sneak peek, so bear with me. So the client of this house wanted to connect a series of detached structures. As you see here, there's kind of 3 structures, and to make a single kind of house out of many parts. So the existing main house, the detached ADU, which is 5 feet away from it, and then a garage, which is going to become a kind of office space and rec room for the kids. So the project was really about trying to capture these spaces while allowing it to bleed out to produce one house and many spaces at once. So as a starting point, we proposed an L-shaped sort of like plug, right? Like how do we jam up the space between and connect the whole thing together? And then as we started to develop the project more and more, it became a more kind of nuanced way of stitching and binding the container of the house together into a single form. The roof lines extend, the kind of existing roof line extends and then comes back at the same slope as the lower level there. Again, kind of pinching a clear story and a split and bringing in a big lantern of light into the primary bedroom on the left. However, while the single form of the kind of wrapper of like roof, etc., bind the house together, the contents within are allowed to exceed the limits of the container, to spill outward into the yard, to extend beyond the fixed boundaries of the footprint. And so here you can see in plan the way that kind of the projection out, the kitchen area kind of twists and pivots, steps down to create a kind of breakfast nook that's an indoor-outdoor nook, and widens the corridor of the existing house to kind of, let's say, create a public passage and a private passage along that corridor. And each of the programs within that we've kind of been working on is allowed to like spill and touch, kind of exceed its limits. So this is what that looks like. So each articulated area of the house is saturated and allowed to bleed into the more generic commons, producing throughout the house hints and glimpses of what lies within. So the house is bounded and unbounded to allow for a diverse set of connections across the project. And I'll take you through a couple of vignettes. So this is kind of where the kitchen bleeds outward beyond the kind of threshold of the indoor-outdoor kind of retractable partitions. And the terracotta brick kind of allows us to occupy the inside and the outside simultaneously. There's a kind of bar area that negotiates between existing dining room and the kitchen. And that really sits at the threshold between all of the spaces of the house. So as elsewhere in the project, I'm really interested in how spaces can be defined by their ground plane and how these surfaces can support and contradict the vertical boundaries around them. So thinking through each surface quality became a large part of the project, which is why it may be called a loose collection of floors. So here there's the kind of traditional black and white articulation of a bar, traditional bar floor, slipping out of the kind of bounds of the doorway and into the corridor. And this continues throughout in each of the small spaces, the primary bath and how it leaks in and out of the adjacent spaces, the kids' bathroom, and how it starts to define the laundry room outside. And so there's a lot more to say about this project, but you'll have to wait for it to be built and completed, and we'll see how it all kind of meets the reality of building soon. But essentially, I think these two projects are trying to extend and like bring in some of the insights from the speculative work in how we might kind of challenge architecture's containers and confinements, right, to produce and invite other occupancies and socialities that might happen in valences. So lastly, and more briefly, I'll speak through some of the work that I've done here in teaching, and this is really going to be a rapid fire because I see that I'm already at the 20. So the first is an undergraduate studio called This Is Not a Party Wall, where the students were thinking through negotiating the space of a small infill lot with two neighbors through the conceit of a party wall. So thinking about how the party wall could start to embed a staircase as well that could start to both deal with a segregation and connection between two neighbors. They started out with really abstract project. This is probably what you guys will be doing, thinking about how a drawing like this might be interpreted three-dimensionally. And once they had a kind of sectional idea that emerged through their reading of line weights of that previous drawing, they would have to discipline this kind of sectional exuberance with the kind of scale and measure of a staircase, and how that could be now form a kind of armature that could negotiate the conflicting demands of two neighbors. So they worked with isolated kind of circulation models, really working through the rise and run and how that could start to animate an entire kind of relationship between two groups of people. So they were packing and nesting circulation to produce unexpected resolutions, threshold and passage. We had to rethink everything in order to do this. What is a door? What is, what is a stair? So at times they would think about how to bury a stair into the perceived thickness of a wall. And at other times that might have a reading of surface, and that allowed the simultaneity of two staircases to be packed in at once, the way that you might cut in and out of space running kind of parallel to or cutting against the grain, et cetera. And so we were working with CNC milled plywood models and foam core to kind of think about thickness as a proxy for construction, details and joints, and how that all kind of keeps extending the conceptual project as well, and informs the conceptual project. So these are our last few images. And let's say the last one that I'll just kind of flick through is the most recent, and maybe the one that brings me and Neil back into conversation, is the project that's from house to housing. So thinking through the qualities of the single family, what it means to live in a house and what it means to live in housing. So students started by looking at 5 ubiquitous LA types of housing: bungalow courts, dingbats, courtyards, et cetera. And then started to kind of reconsider those typologies in new ways. And that ended in a kind of massive exercise in this very room where we looked at 100 types of housing, where they generated many models, and we talked about them and cataloged them and categorized them. And then we started to introduce public programs and bringing in other constituents into housing, because as we've seen in some of the work already, there's always the way that meets the city and the demands and amenities and needs of the city. So students then kind of worked carefully to interweave the concerns of residents and those of a broader public, nesting together 2 kinds of buildings at once, developing nuanced propositions on the interface and interaction within and without. And then really trying to describe what it means to live in a place. Like, how do we make claims and how do we project desire in the work that we do beyond typology, beyond spatial organization? And so that created a kind of concurrent project of like, what does it mean to make the image of housing? And so I'll leave you there, in kind of thinking about how it is. This maybe takes us back into thinking, right? From thinking to building to teaching and back again. How it is that we kind of produce our ideas through these different media that we're working in. And so I think that brings me to the end. Thank you.